Hi guys, and welcome to Faewood. So this is another project for my backdrop. You guys, if you've been watching my videos, would have seen that I've been working on some various things to put in my backdrop. And this one is a Brian Froud pressed fairy, or at least it's inspired by the Brian Froud pressed fairy books. So I wanted to create a fairy that I had captured in glass. I've seen some of the ones that looked a bit more dead, I guess, and I wanted a fresher specimen. So I decided to make one myself. Now my husband has these boxes that he got for port, and I thought this was a perfect thing to use to put my pressed fairy into. Now it was a bit rough around the edges, and I had to first take the felt out. As you can see, I'm removing all the felt bits, and now also using just sort of a Stanley knife thing to remove any excess. I've used my black enamel paint to paint the inside of this. I wanted black because I figured the fairy would stand out in front of this. So I have a couple of the pressed fairy books, and if you're not familiar, it's a really fun book or series of books about fairies that have been captured as if they're like a pressed flower in the pages of a book. So they look a bit skewiff, they're really colourful, they're caught off guard with these crazy expressions. It's just really fun, so I thought it'd be really cool to have a pressed fairy in my backdrop. So I've used this sculpted clay. It's the first time using this clay. You do need to work it a bit like any sort of polymer clay type of material to warm it up. So I did that first, and as I was doing that, I started to see the shape of a body emerging. To be honest, I saw the shape of a fairy bum, so I went with that. I have a few different types of tools that I've bought over the years. They're like wax carving tools, I guess. They're really handy for making things like this because they can help you sculpt and move the clay around. If you don't have this though, you can use anything that you can think of. So you could use utensils, probably not ones you're going to eat from later. You can use things like skewers, you could use popsicle sticks or whatever to sculpt your fairy. And it's just a matter of, you know, adding and subtracting the clay where you think it needs to be added and subtracted. But have a picture with you if you're not very good with sculpting. The best thing I can say is have a picture nearby for you to work from, and you know, just slowly work it up. The thing is with this clay is that if you make a mistake, you can change it, so you just keep working with it until you're happy with how it's looking. Now I added little bits and pieces of the clay as well, so you can see I've got a lump of clay there, and I'm pulling little pieces off and attaching it to my fairy, because that helps me slowly work it up and work out where I need a bit more volume, and then I can use my tools to remove a bit of volume if I need to as well. Now the thing with the pressed fairy is because they are something that's sort of captured in a strange pose, there's a bit of leeway for it to not be perfect. And I'm certainly no doll maker. I am pretty new to creating things like this, so I just try and do my best, I guess. But yeah, the pressed fairies, they can look really fun. They can look really elongated or shortened. They don't have to be anatomically correct because they're a fairy. So fairies, especially in the Froud realm, you'll notice have really accentuated features, and different fairies have different features that are accentuated. So some might have really long limbs, some might have a really big bum, and different things like that. So don't be too worried about being perfect. In fact, it's better if it's not perfect. So I decided to give my fairy a surprised expression. That's why I've opened her mouth up, and I'll be making it look like she's been caught off guard. She's starting to develop here as I go along, but yeah, it's just adding little bits and pieces and smoothing bits out, removing pieces, and just keep going until you feel happy with the way it's looking. Now, of course, I had to put some little fairy ears on her, little elven looking ears. So I just rolled the fingers in my hands a little bit to smooth them out a bit once I cut them there. You might have also noticed I placed a bit of wire inside the fairy, and you'll see why I did that later. It's just basically because I want her to look like she's floating in the box, so I wanted a bit of wire that I could use so that she sits up in the air, if you like. So I'll be curling that around. And if you are doing that, make sure it's a strong gauge wire, because it does need to hold the fairy up. So you want probably 18 gauge or more thickness to make sure it does hold the weight. Now, I found the image of these wings online, and I'll put the link up on the screen for you if you want to use them. And then I'm using fantasy film to create the wings. Now, on top of the fantasy film, I've got this red craft wire that I'm using. It doesn't need to be particularly strong, but I would say maybe thicker is better because it just looks nicer. So maybe say 22 gauge maybe as a minimum to make them look really nice. Now I'm using my Boyle's craft glue. You guys have seen me use this a million times, and I'm just putting that down to stick the bits of wire on here. What I'm doing as well is making sure that I'm making each wing symmetrical. So the image that I'm using as the backdrop is really just a guideline, but it's more important that your wings match. So whatever you do on one wing, just make sure you do it on the other wing as well. So when I cut a piece of wire, I always cut 2 pieces of wire the same length. And then I do my best to curl them the same way so that each is a mirror image of the other one. Now, in some instances I found it easier to pipe the Boyle's glue straight on the wire and then stick it down, and then other instances I found it easier to put the glue on the fantasy film and then put the wire down on top of that. You'll notice a couple of times here I use a brush to smooth out any excess, and that's just so there's no real blobs of glue, because you don't want that. It doesn't look so great. Now I did use a little bit of tape on the fantasy film because it was moving around on top of the image, so that just helps it stay in place while I organise the wire on the wings. Now fairy wings are typically insect-like, so if you find any insect wing template, it will look very fairy-like once you're done, especially when you're using fantasy film because it's got that iridescence to it, and then you can decorate it however you like afterwards. So on the outside I'm using just these little spines and gluing those down, and then I'll cut the fantasy film out around those spines as well. Now I printed two versions of these wings off because I wanted a top and bottom wing, because often you'll see fairies having two sets of wings, and so I just used the same image but I reduced its size and printed it off. You don't even necessarily need a photo editing software for this. You could just print it at reduced percentage of the original and that should work out. You might need to play around with the size a couple of times to get the right size. The main thing is it needs to fit in the box that you're putting a fairy into. So you might notice that what I'm putting on top of this design is quite loose in terms of following the actual shape of the wings underneath it, and that's absolutely fine because you're just using it as a guideline to help you make those wings symmetrical, and as long as they do look sort of insect-like, then you'll be fine. So then I'm using this 3D crystal lacquer. This just adds a bit more texture to your wings and a thickness to them. And also actually probably some durability. So I fill out all of the sections and I'm filling the whole thing in. You can actually do more texture than I've done and not fill the whole things in. I have seen people do different patterns and designs and things with this 3D paint, but I just decided I wanted to fill the entire wings in and make them a bit thicker, a bit sturdier and all of that. And then once it's all dry, I cut it out. Now I did notice at first the boils glue went a bit sort of white and wasn't transparent, but after time, once that I guess cured or what have you, it went all transparent again, so that was okay. But you might need to play around with different glues depending on how they react with the crystal lacquer. Now do be careful when you're using the lighter, but you use the lighter to melt down the outside edges, and having done the 3D lacquer will help not melt too much of the wings as well. Now it's time to paint my fairy. She's been baked in the oven, and I did have a bit of an issue with her foot coming off earlier, which was a problem. And I'm using a acrylic paint, which is meant to be a skin tone, but it's very peach, so I don't think it's anyone's real skin tone. But the thing with the pressed fairies is, you might notice in the pictures I showed earlier, they're all very pastel tones in all different colours of pastels. So what I did was use this skin tone, which was a peachy colour, and then just added other pastel colours to that as well. Pastel yellow, green, and then added some deeper colours in to add some dimension. Now again, these fairies are pressed fairies and they've been a bit splattered, and you'll notice in the book or books that Brian Froud has done on the pressed fairies that there's lots of splats. The fairies are sort of discoloured. It's, you know, they've been captured, I guess, and sort of splattered across the page, and that's what I'm trying to show with my fairy as well. I'm not trying to make it look like realistic shading. It's very discoloured in all different pastel tones, and I've just done different splotches of colours all around it. Now, one thing I didn't mention earlier was when I fired my fairy, the limbs did move slightly, so I would probably, if I was redoing this, I would maybe create more of a structure for the body underneath. I hadn't used this clay before, so I wasn't sure how it was going to perform for a size, for a fairy like this size. But now that I've used it, I would say, just for firing purposes at least, having some sort of armature underneath would have helped, because I found the hand and one of the feet moved, and that's why one of the feet broke off, actually, because I was seeing if I could correct it while it was still hot, and it was quite brittle, so it the foot did come off. It wasn't a problem though, because I just used some E6000 and glued the foot back on. So I'm adding some detail into the face here. It definitely pays to have a really fine detail brush, otherwise this will be really difficult to do. So now that the painting's done, I decided to use some Pearl-Ex, and this gives the skin a really shiny iridescent sort of finish, which I think is very fairy-like, so I thought it would be good to put that on here as well. Then I wanted to decorate the wings a little bit more, so I've used some glitter, and I wanted them to still be quite see-through, so I've used just the clear iridescent glitters that I had on hand, and that just added a bit more sparkle to the wings. Now for a little bit of extra decoration, I'm just using some sequins that I had. Again, pale in colour, not wanting to detract too much from the wings themselves, I just kept the details quite simple. And if you want some inspiration on how to make some fairy wings, I would probably recommend looking into butterfly wings, because a lot of the fairy wings are very similar to butterfly wings in colouring, or perhaps you could look at dragonfly wings. It depends on the look you're going for, but there's all sorts of beautiful insect wings you could look at. Now I wanted to give her some hair, of course, and these pressed fairies do not have normal coloured hair by any stretch, so I've used the silk that I have on hand. You could use silk or wool, I guess, if you're trying to do it the same way I have. This is silk tops, it's called, which is silk fibres, and I've just used again my Boyle's glue. But what I do is fold the threads down when I'm pressing it against her hairline, so that they fold under themselves, and that gives a nicer hairline, a more realistic look. And I've continued to add more pieces along what would be the hairline, and add the glue on top of the previous bits of silk to really thicken up the hair until I was happy with the final product. Now, time to join the wings up. This ended up a little bit messy, I'll be honest. Probably just too many pieces of wire, because I've got 2 bits of wire sticking out of each wing, whereas it would have been better just to have the one, but I wasn't sure how this was going to finish out. But I just bound the wings together by twisting the wire in on itself. And then just trim any excess sharp pieces off the wire. Now, as I said, they do need to fit in the box that I've picked. So I did sort of test them out, because that was the largest piece of the fairy, and bent them in on themselves a little bit to let them fit really nicely in there, and then I knew I could glue them to the back of the fairy and they would fit pretty well. Now, because this is a pressed fairy, I decided I'd put some splats in the box as well, because maybe the fairy splattered into the actual box, and I thought that would be kind of fun. So I've gone in with the same colours that I used on my fairy. I thought it would be better to keep the colour theme consistent. Now, to put the wings on my fairy, I've used a 2-part epoxy, araldite to be specific, and I've been quite generous with how much I put on my fairy, and then I left it for a really good amount of time so that it was nice and cured. Now, because it's a 3D shape, I wanted to make sure it stayed on while it was gluing, so I've used a little hair clip, but I put a little bit of paper in the teeth of the hair clip so that it didn't damage the fairy. And then I've used Art Alchemy wax around the box just to add a bit of sheen to the box edges as well. Now, you'll notice that bit of wire has been twisted at the bottom to create a little stand for her so that she doesn't sit, you know, just on the ground. She's sort of floating in the box. And there's the finished product. I hope you guys have enjoyed this. I'm sure some of you could probably make an even better fairy than I have. I'd love to see what you guys come up with, but I thought you might enjoy seeing something like this and maybe want to make your own pressed fairy for your home or your bedroom. Alright guys, thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time in Faewood. Bye guys.